Good evening, everybody, and welcome to another episode of the Illinois Green Party series with your hosts, David Rich and Calvin Tomasco. Calvin, how are you?
Hey, I'm doing great. I'm happy to be here.
All right, good. Yeah, and we have a recurring guest here, Larry. Pronounce the last name for me one more time.
Spivak.
Spivak. I wasn't sure if it was Spivak or Spivak. Okay, thank you.
Who
who is the president of Illinois Labor History Society? Welcome back to the show. Last time we had you on, we had a fascinating conversation about labor in Illinois mostly, but in other areas of the country as well, across the world. Talked about the Haymarket Affair, May Day, and such. So we wanted to have you back on. Labor is something very important to all three of us, obviously, but throughout the course of the show, Calvin and I have certainly disclosed to one another that labor is an extremely important issue to both of us. And I'm glad that Calvin could make it tonight because that's probably a little bit more his thing than mine, but just a little.
Labor should be everybody's thing because we all work. But
100%. Yeah, but
I'm just
no, I know you are. Which is it's the labor movement and that. So I was hoping to talk more about the activism of the labor movement. We talked about the Haymarket Affair last time, and that's certainly a big part of it. People got killed and executed for it, and that speaks tones to what the tensions at the time and what was going on at the time. But the Pullman riots and the stockyard strikes and things like that, and the things that got us, how we got to the point where we actually have child labor laws now, and we actually have 40-hour work weeks, and we have vacation time, sick time, and weekends. Because at some point, folks, we didn't have that. Okay, you were almost like the only difference between like full-blown slavery and what was going on at the time is that you technically could quit your job and not get like arrested and put in jail for it. That's about the only difference because everything else was just about as akin to slavery as you're going to get. So, Larry, why don't you start us off with, you were saying something about you guys having something coming up this weekend or next weekend. Why don't you go ahead and talk about that first?
All right. Well, I'll just quickly mention for those who weren't on the last time that the Illinois Labor History Society is probably the most prestigious labor history organization in the world, certainly the United States. And it's because we are the steward of the Haymarket Martyrs Monument. And we were formed in 1969 to honor May 1st and the story behind Haymarket, which was so misunderstood and so improperly told. In fact, I'll admonish you for a moment because you called it the Haymarket Riot, and it wasn't a riot.
Oops, I know, I misspoke.
That's okay. It's a good talking point. And so from that perspective, I like to say that anybody that even knows about it calls it that, but that is because of the way the history is told to skew the idea of the story that the story of Haymarket is about some kind of violent attack on police, when in fact it was just the opposite, the police attacking workers for fighting for the 8-hour day. But I won't go into all that history because it's really about Illinois Labor History Society. As the steward of the Haymarket story and the monument, of course, we want to let people know what really occurred and the fight for the 8-hour day. But in terms of what we do every single year, we have an event called the Union Hall of Honor where we induct people who've had a role in the history of labor in Illinois. And this year, our program, which is virtual and available to all the viewers, if they go to our website, illinoislaborhistory.org, I'll say it again, illinoislaborhistory.org, you'll see that you can buy a ticket. I think it's $20 for non-members, $15 for members, and it's a Zoom. It's a Zoom event, so it's virtual this year as it was last year, and we are inducting 4 people. One is, let me just say, the theme this year. It's a little bit almost. Some people would think is outside our purview. It's basically labor and civil rights. And but there's a great story about civil rights and labor and how they're intersectional, how they connect. And this year, the Reverend Jesse Jackson, the general president of the United Electrical Workers, Carl Rosen, a person who was on our board, who was a longtime United Auto Workers activist who is recently deceased, Michael Civaway Elliott. He was part of the Detroit Black Workers Movement and came to Illinois and struggled within the United Auto Workers for civil rights and justice, and in his later years worked to do police reform. And historical figure, C.T. Vivian, who very few people would know about, who was part and parcel of trying to engage labor in getting trades, the work of the trades into the Black African American community, which was a civil rights issue as well. And so our program is December 3rd, Friday, 6:30 p.m. And our keynote speaker is somebody who perhaps a few of your viewers would know is Sarah Nelson. She's the president of the International Association of Flight Attendants. And she's one of the more, how shall I say it, labor advocates that has become very well known in the country because of her stand against, actually, she played a key role in stopping the government shutdown 2 years ago. And the flight attendants have been very outspoken against what's happening in the airline industry. And so Sarah Nelson is our keynote, and it'd be a great opportunity for your viewers to participate in this.
Yeah, that's great. Could you say the date and time one more time?
December 3rd, this Friday, 6:30 p.m. IllinoisLaborHistory.org.
Yeah, there you go. There it is on the bottom right there, folks. Sounds very cool. Yeah, I'll have to check that out. Calvin?
I wanted to make a point about the distinction of riots. Usually, I think most people, especially the way we were taught, we instinctually default to, or not instinctually, but we're taught to default to, oh, there was a riot, and then the police arrived to try to contain or curtail the riot. But that is not always the case. There are times in history where police are the cause of the riot, known as a police riot. So I really like that we're dissecting and we're being specific here, and we're saying, okay, it was the Haymarket massacres, or it was the Haymarket
affair, yeah.
Right.
Well,
right.
In fact, your point is that the history of labor and police is pretty well understood that when there was violence, it was because the police came to disrupt a picket line into the recent past. It's not just the 19th century or into the 1920s, but even into the recent past, that workers lawfully protesting, or in America, it's sometimes unlawful to actually have a picket line for reasons beyond one's imagination, but that's the labor law of America. And the role of law enforcement has often been to create dissension and create disorder, as opposed to, I was going to remember an old Mayor Jay Daley,
Democratic National Convention, yeah.
Right. We're not here to create disorder. We're here to preserve disorder. And
we're not here to prevent it. We're here to preserve it. Yeah.
Yeah.
Idiot.
Yeah. So anyway, that's how it's the attack on workers' civil rights has been ongoing since workers have tried to organize.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's true. Don't quote me on this because I'm not going to remember her name, but there was some sort of sociologist on NPR over the summer. I'm already starting out vague, I understand, but said basically that there have been studies, tracing protests back from the 60s up until now, that the main cause of peaceful protests turning riotous is police presence. Not all the time, but she said the main cause. So, yeah, I mean, there's that.
Yeah, and then that was all an aside, so pardon the interruption, but what I really want to talk about tonight that we didn't get to last time is the idea of, I guess, the great launching point is Pullman National Park and especially the A. Phillip Randolph Historic Museum. Could you tell us a little bit about that, Larry?
So I guess the question is, do we want to talk about the history of Pullman, or you want to talk specifically about concurrent national park and
I'd like to hear the history personally.
it's a well, I'll start to present and then kind of work back. For those who live in the Chicago area, but those who are going to visit Chicago at some point in the future, or if you haven't thought about it, now is a really good opportunity to visit one of the new national parks. That's an urban national park. There's a couple of them: Cesar Chavez in California, Lowell in Massachusetts for textile workers, and Pullman. And Pullman was a community that was created by George Pullman, the namesake, and beginning around 1880, and built a company town to build the Pullman Palace cars. Again, back to the present, in 2014, President Obama signed an executive order because the Congress wouldn't have passed it otherwise, to create Pullman National Monument, which National Monument is essentially a national park. It's a little different funding issue for it, but it is on the south side of Chicago. It was its own town back in the 1880s, but was annexed in 1892 to become part of Chicago. And now that it's a national park, it's being restored, and it's an entire. It's about 500 acres of town and old factory and old hotel and much of it's being restored. The town itself is currently part of Chicago, and people live in the community. But the housing is distinct. It's very European looking. The factory buildings, of which were what remains. There's a lot of restoration taking place to try to create what was once the factory setting. At least one of the many buildings of the huge assembly line, long predated Ford when we talk about assembly lines. And what's so significant about this is that the story of Pullman is really the story of all of us. It's the story of America, because it's the story of race, story of class, the story of gender, the story of industry, capital, labor, and the great Pullman strike that was in 1894, an event that changed America in a number of ways. So come to Chicago to Pullman National Monument, and the Illinois Labor History Society has had the opportunity with the National Park Service and the Historic Pullman Foundation to help tell the story of, and our role is to tell the story of workers and the story of labor and the social history, which is a little different from how other people tell the story. We focus on those issues. And it's the story of the Great Depression of 1893 into 1894 that caused workers to walk out of that factory when George Pullman wouldn't talk to the workers about their grievances, which is basically a company town where workers paid George Pullman to buy the food from Pullman, to pay for health service from Pullman, to rent his houses. And when he cut their wages 50% in 1894 and wouldn't talk to them about lowering their rents, they walked out. And other important figures in America come to be part of this story. Eugene Debs, of course, is probably the most well-known to those of us who know labor history, but not well-known to America, unfortunately. And it's helps create the idea of organizing workers on an industrial basis as opposed to a work craft basis that was the story up until that point. And so there are many issues, and it's a story of civil rights, because the Pullman Porters, all African American union that finally started organizing and got its contract in 1937, goes all the way back to right after the end of slavery. So these are the stories that are told to America, but that we can tell, and that the national park now can tell, and it's really very exciting. And Kelvin, my understanding is that you went down there recently to investigate.
Sorry about that. It was a profound and excellent visit. We started where it almost seemed to celebrate the engineering accomplishments and architectural accomplishments of Pullman, the city, and of the rail car industry. And that made me feel uneasy because I knew the backstory. And then we got to the sections where it celebrated the labor organizing, and then we finished off with the Phillip Randolph History Museum, and we watched a documentary while we were there, and just amazing to learn about the All African American Union forming and how they had to do it in secrecy. And I think it's a good thing to know critiques of labor in general as well, because Eugene Debs wanted the Black Porters Union to be part of the overall labor organizing movement, but he was voted against, or was argued against that happening. So the All Black Porters Union had to form in absolute secrecy and without help from the other sectors. So they really paved a way and fought for their labor rights to be recognized. And it took many battles, times where it looked like it wasn't going to happen for a long stretch of time, but they kept it going. They kept the meetings going strong, the membership strong, and eventually they were able to successfully have their union recognized. And it was an amazing story, an amazing full day. So folks, if you can make it out there, do, because it's a wonderful full day experience.
Nice.
Yeah.
That's very cool.
Yeah, I was so excited. Could you talk a little bit about who Phillip Randolph is?
So Phillip Randolph was a part of the Black Renaissance of Harlem in the after World War I into the 1920s, and he's a socialist. He's a poet. He's a writer. He's an intellectual, and he was hired by the fledgling Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters to organize the porters who took care of the guests on these Pullman palace cars that traveled all around the United States. They were actually all around the world, but in the United States, after the Civil War, as Pullman cars were being used as the idea of luxury rail travel was developing cross country, George Pullman said that he would only hire ex-slaves and African-American men to be porters. And the reason of this racist idea was that only in his mind, Black men could be subservient and service the white clientele who would be on these rail cars. He said that a white man might someday rise above his class, or he might run into a person he once took care of on the rail cars, and he didn't imagine that was a proper thing. And so the other, of course, is always about capital, which is that he could pay African Americans less, African American men, and they had to work for tips. They weren't salaried, and so originally they worked for tips, and it was so they would have to provide really good service, and it was his racist view of the world. And so African Americans worked on the railroad, while white Americans were organized into unions within the factory that built the railroad cars. But as you mentioned, the American Railway Workers Union didn't allow African Americans into the union at that point. And by 1925, in terms of organizing, they decided that you couldn't have a porter, actually, or porters organize the union because they'd be fired. As even today, workers are fired for organizing unions by the tens of thousands. But back then, it wouldn't even have been possible. So they hired Phillip Randolph to become their organizer. And in 1925, he took up the campaign, and it took 12 years to get the contract. In 1935, after the National Labor Relations Act was passed, it pushed corporations to have to bargain with unions. And they eventually, 2 years after the act, got their first contract. And there's a great book called Rising from the Rails, The Building of the Black Middle Class by Larry Tye. And it tells the story. There are other people who've written books about the Porters, but it tells the story of how once African Americans who worked in their first black union in America got a contract, they created a job that was a living wage in that period of time. And many great African Americans were porters. By the 1960s, I believe it was, 1 out of 3 African American physicians at some point in their life prior to becoming a physician were a porter. Thurgood Marshall, the great Supreme Court justice who argued the case early in his career in 1954, Brown versus Board of Education, Thurgood Marshall was a Pullman porter. Malcolm X was a porter. It was not unusual to be, because it became a good job once it was unionized. But this sad story is that they had to form their own union because whites would not accept blacks into the labor movement in that particular industry.
Yeah, and that's definitely part of the irony of the history of the labor movement is that sort of like, racial and sex-based discrimination. It seems, you think about unions nowadays, or I think about unionism and what it means. It goes exactly against everything it's supposed to be standing for from the get-go.
Well, so, one thing we have to recognize is that institutions are made up of the people in the society, right. And so
everything looks good on paper.
And it's no apology; it just is
right.
the case, and so that plays out in America, which is the story of slavery is the story of America, which we refuse to acknowledge to this day. So
yeah, exactly. Right.
Yeah, I always get upset when I hear of instances where there just wasn't recognized solidarity between fellow wage earners. Like,
right.
You all stand to benefit, and you're all stronger when you're together.
I will add one. Although that story is prevalent in the labor movement, the labor movement also is one place that actually united people of race, class, gender in ways that nowhere else in society. So historically, that plays out the segregation and the idea of Jim Crow. But on the other hand, there are numerous stories that actually are just the opposite so it's also the labor movement where racial solidarity, class solidarity come into play, because that's when we had the victories. It was often because of that. In the 1930s is a great example, but even predating that. So it's a mixed bag.
Yeah. But I think we've learned, hopefully, all labor movement has learned from these past mistakes, and hopefully intersectionalism is the way we go forward. And that's what I'm seeing so far, like with the UAW and so many other actions. It seems to be much more intersectional. Also with the Amazon unionization attempts, I'm seeing a lot of excellent intersectionality.
Did that one in Kansas take?
Oh, I don't know about the one in Kansas. Larry, do you know about that?
I don't think I know what you're referring to.
Was it in Kansas? Yeah, over the summer there was
Oh, that was Alabama.
Bessemer, Alabama.
That one's still being contested.
Okay. You had asked me about Phillip Randolph, and I would be remiss if I didn't come back to him for a moment to talk about. As I mentioned, our Union Hall of Honor induction, and our theme is civil rights. One of our themes is civil rights. And most people wouldn't know this, because when people think about civil rights in America, they think about, if they think about it or are taught about it, they're taught about Martin Luther King. But few people know that Martin Luther King's mentor was A. Phillip Randolph, the great labor leader, and who, after the Pullman contract, pressured the United States government to desegregate the military industry, and who very well understood activism at a level that caused Martin Luther King to understand that this idea of, from sit-down strikes of the labor movement in the 1930s to the idea that civil rights was a worker, what was as much about work. So, in other words, economic justice was a way to achieve social justice. And it was A. Phillip Randolph who called for the March on Washington for job against poverty and jobs in 1963, the great "I Had a Dream" speech, which is something that many Americans now know about, was A. Phillip Randolph, who was the primary architect of that march. And so you have this labor leader who is really kind of pushing the idea of economic justice and social justice together. So we talk about intersectionality, and he is one of the classic and great examples, if not the best example, in America.
Absolutely. That was back in the day when unions were a lot more higher priority in the American eye. Nowadays, I think it's dropped down to like, what, 9-10% of the workforce is unionized?
It's about 12%, but
12%.
but that's in that. So what you have is about 6% in the private sector, which is really sad, since most people are private sector workers. But if you add public sector, which is about 35% organized, you get 12%. So about 12% of the eligible workforce, non-management workforce, is unionized in this country.
Right. I do remember one of the reasons we wanted to have you back on today was to talk about the tensions and the things that happened between the anarchists and the Marxists back in the day during the labor movement. You saw a division there. Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels had written, or Marx wrote Das Kapital and then the Communist Manifesto. It's kind of a call to arms to go ahead and pursue this vision, and which established Marxism as an economic system, specifically with its value labor theory at the center of it. Well, so basically what he wanted to do is he wanted to kind of like nationalize the banks and the railroads and like the bigger industries first. But if you really read his dialectical materialism, it's a process that unravels over time in history. It's called historicism. It's this whole philosophical thing. The end goal of Marxism is no state at all. That's the end goal, is to end up with like just a free people able to reason for themselves how to act towards one another in an economic system. Well, Mikhail Bakunin, for example, was like kind of one of the first ones, and he was a Marxist at the time, a part of that party. And he said, no, the state is the problem. You don't use the thing that's the problem to fix the problem. You get rid of it. Okay, you don't just wait to see what happens over time. That's nonsense. So basically, I'm massively oversimplifying it, but that's basically what happened is, as far as like the ideological division between the two. No, we got to have to make sure a strong state first, and then it fizzles out over time, and versus stop the state right now. Can you speak on that disparity?
Yeah, and I'm kind of curious what's happening, like the labor movement throughout history, and then their relationship to maybe anarchist parties or socialist parties, because I understand the U.S. has had two major socialist parties and one communist party. I'm not familiar if they had a anarchist party, but yeah, what's going on?
I think an anarchist party would be an oxymoron. But the philosophy of that, if you look at the early labor movement in America after the Civil War in particular, and the immigration from Germany and people who were more familiar with ideas of socialism that was developing, especially after the Paris Commune of 1871, you had these prevailing philosophies. You had anarchists, anarcho-syndicalist people who were anarchists but believed in more organization. You know, there are probably different wings of anarchism. I'm not as well versed in the specifics of this, but like as always has been the case in movements, there are always different ideas and ideals. And you mentioned, you know, the idea of utopian socialism, the idea that one day everybody would just sort of live in this commune type of life where we're all working for the betterment of society, and there was no way, you know, the idea in part, which was it's kind of funny to talk about prevailing wage. A prevailing wage idea was that there would be no wages, that there would be no reason, because everybody would be working for each other, from each according to his ability to each according to his need, or whatever the cliche is. So clearly these ideas, I mean, this is, you know, kind of the esoteric story of the American left, I suppose. You know, there actually were several different, you know, there was the Communist Labor Party, the Communist Party, the Socialist Party, Socialist Labor Party, and then no shortage of groups in between. With different ideas. And I suppose the part of the problem of all these ideologies is similar as they may have been on one hand, where people would end up factionalizing over the meaning of a particular sentence. That's kind of the story of the left, and which probably is one reason that America is, you know, a non-existent left, if you will. I mean, it's ironic it's so funny when the right talks about Joe Biden being a socialist. You know, and the idea, we don't really, we're the only industrialized developed country in the world that doesn't have a labor party. You know, and the Labor Party in some countries is almost a right-wing party in those countries, but it would be a left-wing party in this country. So it's all very diffused and unfocused, and it's we could talk for hours about the idea of these various groups and left groups and parties, but I don't know how well it serves us or doesn't to know about this. I think it's important to know history, but it's probably been, on one hand, maybe this is the paradox, is as these organizations, people of the different organizations, sometimes work together and sometimes fought each other, and sometimes at the expense of progress. So because of just ideological differences over the meaning of a particular word or idea.
I like to think of it in historical terms as like anarchists through the Haymarket affair, Haymarket massacre. They helped bring us the 8-hour day. And then later on, I think there was a much larger movement of socialists, because eventually Eugene Debs goes on to run under the U.S. Socialist Party and gets 1 million votes in his second running, correct?
That's correct.
That whole movement, the Pullman movement, fought for labor's right to organize, right?
Yeah. Eugene Debs was, it was after the Pullman strike that he really took up the cause of socialism, because he saw that capitalism was not going to be able to meet the needs of most working people, and so he evolved, as many people did, you know. But of course, you had the American Labor, you know, the American Federation of Labor, which you had people who were communists, socialists, and Democrats and Republicans, and but had a much more conservative view, you know, which was focused more on just collective bargaining and not changing the political structure at that time. And then you had people who found the Socialist Party. If you go back to that period after 1900 and 1905, the industrial workers of the world they felt that the Socialist Party was strong, organized in a way that would meet the needs of working people, that it didn't. And so the idea of organizing one union for all workers was a novel idea, and but really became an industrial organizing union in at that period in time. So it's and today we're probably a country that sees. I say a country, I shouldn't say that, but the idea that we use words like socialism is so far outside the nomenclature of what Americans even know or understand. And it's almost laughable when the right wing talks about Democrats being socialists. It's as you well know, it's I guess you could say that Medicare is socialism on one hand, which most of the right wing want to have. They want Medicare. They want, although we know the joke from whatever, I forget when that was, somebody was interviewed and said, I got to get the government out of my Medicare. They didn't understand that it was a government run program. So anyway, I don't, I tend to not want to get caught up in the issues of which left organization has the correct line. But on the other hand, it's a problem in America that the working class workers, progressives really don't understand and have we don't have a labor party. We don't have a sense about that.
That's an interesting point, that we don't have a labor party. I mean, you kind of think of the Democratic Party as the one that sort of embodies the greater tendency towards unions and labor issues, and then the worker, the Republicans just want the owners of industry to make all the money, and everybody else can just go about their way. But to have a specific, explicit labor party, has that ever been attempted as in the, let's say, in the last, since the 60s? Or is there anything like, isn't there something like a family party that's supposed to be something like that?
American worker, yeah, there's organizations. They're the U.S.
Yeah, let me.
There was an effort. I'm losing track of time. I think it's in the 1990s when there was an effort to create a labor party, but it's very, very small. I mean, it's negligible, the number of people who are aware of these kinds of issues. And of course, we have a different tradition. We don't have a parliamentary system in this country, and we don't, for many historical reasons and antecedents, we don't have the, we were what had developed in Europe in the 19th century into the early 20th century. In the period of World War One, we were, a two-party, pretty much a two-party system, and some would say it's a one-party system, but it's so historically different. And the idea that in America, again, some people call it American exceptionalism. There are other reasons. People see life differently. We don't think about a class system. I'm trying to remember who said this, but they said in Europe or in America, somebody sees a limousine go by, and an American worker says, one day I want to be like that person. And in Europe, this goes back many, many years, they'd see the limousine go by and they say, one day that guy's going to be one of us. It's the idea of class. We don't talk about, we don't have a working class. We have a middle class. We talk about the upper class or the wealthy, and we're all middle. Everybody thinks they're middle class. Obviously, 50% of Americans haven't had a wage increase in 40 years, but everybody thinks they're middle class because that's the nomenclature that has been used. So we don't have that, and for many reasons that are objective. It's a different story here than it was in Europe.
Yeah.
It's true. There's several false narratives going on in this country. One of them is what counts as socialism, and there's a different, like you said, Larry. There's all sorts of different schools. There's no doubt. But I actually did a video once early this summer to kind of clarify that whole situation from my own understanding. I actually started with how to construct a definition, literally, just so to simplify the entire process. And the one thing that you see mainly throughout all of them, anarchist and so all the different socialist schools, is basically that the worker owns their labor in a very basic way. There's some other, you can elaborate on that. And some of the schools don't go there, but very, very, very few. It may or may not have to do with a big government. Some systems want a big government in order to ensure that the workers have the right ownership over their property and that the employers aren't taking advantage of them, that kind of thing. There's such a thing as a free market socialism where the workers run everything internally without any external forces telling them what to do. But usually my understanding is that it comes basically down to workers owning their labor. Would you agree with that in your estimations, your studies?
The idea that owning your labor is the basis of democracy, really. If we don't have control over our own labor, then what do we have? Since that's what we do to live. And really goes back to those important heroes and heroines of that period after the Civil War, in particular, like Lucy Parsons, who I don't know that we can credit her with the term to abolish wage slavery, but that's how when I look at various quotes, she talked about not ending, slavery had already ended, but now it was a time to end wage slavery where we had no control over our lives, and then take it to into the 1960s when Martin Luther King gave his speech on there is dignity in all labor, and the idea that work is the fundamental basis of operating society. And you think about it in terms of our constitutional right, the right to pursuit of happiness. It's obviously not realized in under the corporate agenda that we all live under, but it certainly is an ideal, is something that if we can have more control over our own workplace, which is what unions exist for, in part to help us have that kind of democratic experience of day-to-day living, which doesn't really exist and if you have a union, you have a better chance of it because you have representation, you have a voice to depending on where you work and what kind of union you have. But without it, you are basically a wage slave, and it's in a very complex society today, but it's still the case.
Right.
Yeah, I can't get it out of my head once I realized this is any boss or capitalist, the owner of the business, what governmental system do they most relate to? Are they like monarchs? Are they like dictators? Is it like a democracy? And now I know that they're more like dictators. They are dictators over your life at work. That's 8 hours a day, right? For most of us, 5 days a week, at the very least, if not more, sadly. And I think we're raised to view them as like the givers. Oh, they give us these opportunities. No, you are giving them your labor and adding value to their business. And they are the dictators that are deciding where and how all the surplus of that value goes and what happens with it. And they will try to keep your wages as low as possible, and they'll try to make your conditions as profitable as possible. And that may not always be safe. So I think it's healthy for all of us to just have that perspective that, the owners are not there for you in a friendly way. We have democracy in our politics. Why don't we have democracy at work? That should be the norm. I've been finding this fascinating every day that it sinks in more and more.
Yeah.
The print behind me is a print that an artist friend created of the Haymarket Martyrs Monument, but I put that up there to replace a different print that I had, which is kind of a famous poster. Actually, it's on the other wall. It's called Labor. It has a a print of a factory type setting, and it says labor creates all wealth. And that's really the idea that we're talking about, which is working people, whether it's a service industry, professional workers, or industrial work, or any kind of work, anything. Labor creates all wealth, and that is the individual worker, and compositely creates all wealth of the society. And yet they don't share in the wealth. And that really goes back to the basic construct of the idea of why workers should have power and have control over the means of production, if we want to use those Marxist terms. But it is a foreign concept to most Americans, and we are, and so again, the society in America has developed to be what we always call the richest country on earth, with the least, the weakest labor laws, the weakest social investment in workers' rights. And whether it's, here we are, it's 2021, and the Democratic Party wasn't able to put into the current social infrastructure bill the idea of family leave. Medicare for all. We're still we could be
that made me angry too. Yeah, that was exactly my reaction.
It's like wow, it's almost inconceivable, but
those Republicans say they're so pro-family, except you don't get to spend time with your newborn. Sorry.
It's
speaking of having children, and this is a topic I wanted to touch a little bit on, was we're seeing examples like McDonald's putting up signs saying like as young as 14-year-olds can apply, and then I think it's Wisconsin passed a law saying 14-year-olds and that age group are allowed to work past 10 p.m. to 11 p.m. now.
Wow.
And that's just making me think like, okay, we've already done this dance. Could you tell us a little bit about the history of ending child labor? And I mean, I've even read that there were child unions in the mines and in missile factories. Could you talk a little bit about what brought that on and what it was like and how it changed?
Well, let me take you back to the 1830s.
Okay, let's go.
So, we live in, as products of our society, during the early pre-industrialization, that period in the East Coast, Massachusetts, New Jersey, and the states, the 13 colonies, there was a silk mill where the children, understand that adults accepted child labor, just as we kind of accepted slavery, just as we accept women shouldn't have the right to vote, and we can go on and on of these questions in society. Is child labor okay? Well, today most people would say children shouldn't be working in factories instead of going to school. It's a little different question than working at age 14 at McDonald's till 10 o'clock, although on the other hand, you could say it is similar. So children were working in the factories. And it wasn't the adults in 1835 in New Jersey that were trying to stop child labor. Children organized and said, children, and I don't know if I have this right, but I think there was a strike of children at the silk mill to stop children under the age of 12 from having to work a 10-hour day. And so the precursors of ending child labor go back to children themselves organizing because the adults didn't do it. And there's, I'm sure, of course, there are many reasons, there was the only ability to survive at that time. So, but I'd like to take you to the period of the 1890s and Mother Jones. And while it wasn't Mother Jones who started this idea, because really part of the idea of labor unions was to end child labor and to create public education. And the problem of child labor was that it undercut the wages of the adult workers because, it was the case after the Civil War. When Johnny came home from the war, he found that women and children were working for 1/3 or 1/5 the wage that he worked for. And it took until the early 1900s to recover what the workers made in the factories before they went off to war in the Civil War in the North. So it's an economic question of getting control over the labor for better wages, but the indignity the injustice, the inhumanity that children would be working 8, 10, 12, 15 hours in factories. You've all seen the photos of the children, the boys in the mines. And Mother Jones, who most people don't know about to this day, that was really one of her fundamental pieces of work, was to end child labor, was to organize workers, organize the coal miners, and to end child labor. She did a march on Theodore Roosevelt's compound in New York, and I think it was in Long Island, and I'm forgetting the year, right around the turn of the century, 1904 perhaps, to end child labor. And so this history of ending child labor to create a more humane society goes back to especially that period of the late 19th century. But really, child labor laws really didn't even get enacted until during World War I, and then again during the New Deal. So the official end of child labor really is until the New Deal under the Fair Labor Standards Act. And again, children around the world are making the clothes we wear right now. So it's obviously we are here to talk about the United States and the labor movement, but it's undercuts labor everywhere as long as we can employ children, which should be a human rights violation anywhere.
Yeah, agreed.
Yes, absolutely. We were talking a little bit before about the difference between children working in sweatshops, factories under unsafe conditions instead of going to school, and a child working in a family's own restaurant or something like that, which again can be very endearing as long as the kids aren't being again I don't know what the time frame is. I mean, I worked when I was in high school and college and all that stuff, and I never had a problem. But I mean, it'd have been nice when we have to spend more time.
I worked in my family's business. It was on the weekends and some evenings, but yeah, I wasn't going somewhere else. I wasn't dealing with like another foreign boss. It was my dad. So
right, yeah, growing up on a farm, stuff like that.
Yeah,
for sure, for sure. Did we go over sufficiently Mr. Debs and his run for president as a socialist? And we lost him.
We lost the expert. I don't know.
Because you just lost me a second ago, right?
Yeah.
All right. Do you know anything about Debs?
Just that he's sadly, like, I expected a monument of Debs. I expected a small statue of Debs at least at the Pullman National Monument. But I guess it's there mainly for the Pullman actions. You're back.
I have to apologize. I just disappeared. I don't even know what happened. I'm here.
These things happen. Don't worry about it. We're good to have you back.
So I might have missed the last 60
Well, I was going to ask you to expand maybe a little bit about Debs and his run for president as a socialist candidate.
Okay. Well, so Eugene Debs really gets known after he is thrown in prison for leading the American Railway Workers Union strike against George Pullman, because Pullman workers, they supported the Pullman workers joined the strike joined the American Railway Workers Union, Debs's union, in 1894. And Pullman, I mean, this is the, what do we call it? The poetic injustice of America, that the Sherman Antitrust Act was used against Debs and the Railway Workers Union, which ultimately put him in jail for supporting the strike of the Pullman workers. And he is a celebrated figure among the working class all across the country. And in the early 1900s, as he begins to move from being a trade unionist to a Socialist Party leader, he ultimately thinks that that's where the change has to come from, as well as, of course, organizing workers, but with a Socialist Party platform. And in 1912, he received nearly 1 million votes, which again, when he ran in 1919 while he was in federal prison, he received almost 1 million votes again as a convict because he was thrown in jail for opposing World War I, which most good people would have opposed in that period. So he was a great orator. He was charismatic. He was a great, there's a book out by a guy named Ernest Freeburg from, I think it's Eastern Tennessee or University of Tennessee, wrote a book. And the time that Eugene Debs spent in prison in 1895 for his role in the Pullman strike, he became good friends with the sheriff. The sheriff that kept him, would have dinner with him every night because Debs was such a charismatic and intellectual and actually and still down to earth, and people liked him, and he was just such an important person in American history that most of us don't even know about. So, right. It's he exemplifies the story of how we don't tell history, how we don't know who Mother Joan is, we don't know who Lucy Parsons, we don't know who Jenna Lewis is, we don't know who Phillip Randolph is. People who shaped our entire society aren't known by most of the public.
That's another one of many indictments of the American education system. We don't know. We didn't know about the Tulsa, Oklahoma massacre. There's all sorts of racial things we didn't know about in the last couple of years.
I will bet, this story, Calvin brings this idea of labor to the Green Party. Well, I'm saying that based on what you guys talked about, but it would be fun. I know this is the case, that people who are part of some of the new, the current progressive organizations, like the growth of the Democratic Socialists of America, as an example. I've talked to so many of the younger people. They actually, what I'm talking about is so foreign to them. Right. And you think that these are the folks that should understand this, but it's right. outside of their parlance, outside of their, and yet it's fundamental to understanding our story and where we are today. What we did wrong and what we did right and what we did right. So. Right.
Yeah, and that's definitely a heated topic right now, considering like critical race theory and that kind of thing taught in schools and what we're going to teach the kids. All that stuff should be taught, and you're right, the right and the wrong, the good and the bad. So we learn. Ignoring history is another way to repeat it, as they say. So yeah, Cal, we only got a couple minutes left here. Cal, you got any closing questions? If not,
we went through my main ones. Go ahead.
I would really like to talk to you, actually invite you back on again, maybe February, March-ish or something like that, because next year's an election year. And I'd like to talk about the specific candidates and unionism and labor and that kind of thing. You hear Biden talk a lot about, we're going to create green jobs and the union jobs and that kind of thing, which is very cool. I'm very, I would like to see the details of that, first of all. But I mean, okay, It sounds good. So far, it sounds good.
Right.
So I'd like to have you back to talk about that much further. And just to go back real quick to the anarchist versus Marxist thing, and anybody wants to know about it, it's something that's worth researching online. I understand that it can be off-putting to it's so nuanced on naming specific ideas and concepts and stuff like that. But the intellectual difference between, say, Marxism and anarchism is something that should be noted, because you can't be both in a sense. And just to have conceptual clarity of where you stand on things, I think is advantageous without getting too bogged down in it and losing the sight of practicality. Mm-hmm. I would agree with that for sure. And if anybody is wondering, I think the anarchists have the better idea. So studying system science, one of the ideas there is that a sufficiently complex system tends to run more efficiently when it's decentralized. And that applies to just about every sufficiently complex system. And societies and economies are extremely complex. So to have like one central body like ruling over somebody, there's just too many variables to deal with. And, these laws that blanket everything and miss out on the nuances of the situation, that kind of thing. I mean, that's why one of the reasons I like unions. I mean, the unions can get together as laborers in their own specific markets and industries and say, hey, this is what we're going to do with our stuff. We know better because we're the experts in these fields. Basically is what it comes down to. Okay, it's 8 o'clock. Sorry, right. Kevin.
I wanted to ask one small one as a gift for the audience, Larry. Some of us, I just can't find time to read a book. We're terrible millennials. We don't read as much as we should. Are there any movies that come to mind that might capture, people's interest in regards to labor?
Yes, so one of the great directors, of course, there's a number of ones, but probably a lot of us that like film and know that the story of labor is never told, is a John Sayles movie. John Sayles is one of the great American independent filmmakers, Sayles. But the film that just really captures that essence of it's the 1920s labor, the mine wars. It's called Matewan, Matewan. Great movie. John Sayles, and I know it's available. But I mean, there are other films. There's I'm just blanked on it. But of course, Norma Ray is kind of the classic.
Norma Ray, Reds.
Sally
Field.
Reds is less about labor, but
it's
more about the period. But it's John Reed in the the period after the Russian Revolution and an American going over there.
There's the one that's explicitly about unions and strikes and propaganda by the deed with Sylvester Stallone. What's that called?
I think it's Fist.
That isn't Fist. That's full blown about the cops. I mean, you see cops and union guys going at it in the streets at school.
Yeah.
Yes.
So mostly labor is presented in the media in a very negative light, even in Hollywood. Even if for instance, one of the great movies On the Waterfront, of course, labor's corrupt, or it's the corruption of labor, although it's a progressive idea in other ways as a movie, but it's labor is generally poorly portrayed. And that's one reason I like Matewan, because it's about that, the mine wars. And most people don't realize that the U.S. military actually, during the Battle of Blair Mountain in West Virginia in 2021, the U.S. government actually used planes and bombed the workers who were fighting against the mine owners. But there are others. But Salt of the Earth is one of the great classic. It was actually a movie banned and made in the 1950s with some actual rank and file workers in the New Mexico mine, or was it Arizona? I think it was Arizona. So Salt of the Earth is a great movie about that class struggle. So there's a more recent movie, The Killing Floor, that was just re-released about the stockyard, the race riots and the organizing of the stockyard workers. A great movie made in the 1980s. And it's available now, called The Killing Floor. I would really recommend that maybe as another example. So.
Thank you so much. I know our audience is going to appreciate that, myself included.
No, I'm going to go watch the Tomato One thing right now. That's very cool. All right, Larry Spivak, thank you so much for coming on the show. President of the Illinois Labor History Museum, right? Do I have that right? It's not
History Society.
History Society, thank you.
Yes.
Thanks for tuning in to the Illinois Green Party series with your hosts, David Rich and Calvin Tomasco. Till next time, be good and be green.
Okay, take care.